In the early hours of August 26, 133, at exactly 3 a.m., close to 8,000 women stood together inside Chiter Fort, ready to face a night the world would remember with horror. The flames climbed higher than a house, rising about 30 feet, throwing a blazing orange glow across the wide plains of Rajasthan. Inside the fortress walls, girls barely in their teens and women well into their 60s moved in a steady, solemn line toward a huge pit built just for this moment. They were dressed in shimmering silk saris and loaded with heavy gold jewelry, not for celebration, but because they knew their bodies would soon be reduced to nothing but ash. The beat of drums filled the air, pounding like a funeral march, as the first rows of women walked into the inferno. Mothers gripped the hands of their daughters tightly, refusing to let go. Leading them was the queen, her head lifted with pride even as tears slid down her cheeks. This was no riot or frenzy. It was deliberate. Every single one of those 8,000 women had agreed. Better to burn than to suffer the horrors waiting for them once the fortress was overrun. The smallest girls were carried last, some too little to understand why the women around them were singing haunting songs of farewell. Fire devoured silk, skin, and bone with the same hunger. But the bigger question remained. How did the world become so cruel that women chose burning alive over living? Why had history again and again pushed women into a life so unbearable that death seemed like the kinder choice? To grasp this terrible act, we have to step back through centuries of smaller, daily tortures, those hidden cruelties that choked women long before fire ever touched them. In 1847, far from Rajasthan, another kind of suffocation played out in the cotton mills of Manchester. At 5 in the morning, the factory whistle shrieked, and Mary had exactly 3 minutes to pull her corset, so tight she could barely breathe. It wasn't fashion, it was survival. Factory owners demanded tiny 18-inch waists, not to look pretty, but so women could squeeze between the fast-spinning machines to scoop up dropped bobbins and clear dust. Mary yanked her laces until her ribs bent, and each breath felt like a fight. The foreman, Mr. Hartwell, stalked the aisles with a tape measure in hand. A waist wider than 20 inches meant a pay cut. Over 22. You were fired. Just yesterday, Mary saw her friend Sarah collapse, lips blue from lack of air. The machines never stopped for her. She was dragged to the corner, and another woman took her place in minutes. Shifts stretched 14 hours day after day, while their bodies twisted under whalebone cages that crushed ribs into crooked shapes and left lungs working at half their strength. And here's the cruelest part: none of this was illegal. By law, everything Mary earned belonged not to her, but to her father or husband. Mary's 6 shillings a week never even touched her hands. Her father usually drank away the money before she returned home. The corset wasn't just fabric and bone. It was a symbol of the iron cage society had locked around women's lives. And the machines? They were merciless. A strand of loose hair could mean being scalped. A flowing skirt could mean death. Just last month, Lucy Morrison's crinoline skirt was yanked into the gears. The hoops twisted tighter and tighter, pulling her whole body into the machine. The engine couldn't be stopped fast enough. What was left of her was scraped out across 3 separate machines. To add insult to horror, the owner deducted the cost of cleaning the mess from Lucy's wages. Doctors like Benjamin Ward Richardson later recorded the scale of damage in the 1880s. Factory women suffered from collapsed wombs, crushed organs, and constant fainting at rates far beyond women who didn't work in mills. Every year, thousands died from what doctors gently labeled industrial exhaustion, but the numbers hid the truth. It was slow torture dressed up as labor. And even when laws like the Factory Act of 1844 tried to set a limit of 12 hours a day, owners twisted the rules. Cleaning didn't count. Prep work didn't count. The suffering simply went on. The women's day began before sunrise. By 5 in the morning, they were already at their stations, and they weren't released until after 9 at night. On paper, the factory owners claimed fewer hours, but the math was deliberately twisted to hide the truth. Inside the mills, white powder from the cotton floated in the air like snow, but this dust was mixed with lead. Every breath the women took pulled poison deeper into their lungs, and the tight corsets around their ribs made it nearly impossible to cough it back out. For 14 hours a day, their chests felt like they were wrapped in iron bands. What happened inside those walls scarred even the inspectors who witnessed it. Long before the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire horrified America, England had its own deadly tragedies. In 1854, Hutchinson's mill became a death trap. The doors had been locked to stop theft, which also stopped women from stepping outside to catch a breath. That day, the building caught fire. 43 workers, most of them young women, were trapped against the bolted exits. Smoke filled their lungs, corsets squeezed their ribs, and narrow windows became useless escape routes. The fire swallowed them alive. Mary was one of the lucky ones. She survived 6 years in the mills before her body gave out. She died at only 22, the doctors calling it mill fever, a polite way of saying her lungs collapsed from years of breathing in dust and lead. Her father collected the death payment, 2 shillings, nothing more. In the company's books, her tiny 8-inch waist was recorded as satisfactory until the day she died. If Victorian women thought factory life was unbearable, they would have been shocked to know what women centuries earlier endured when even religion seemed to turn against them. In medieval Europe, starvation itself became a badge of honor. Catherine of Siena, who weighed barely 68 pounds when the church declared her a saint, was celebrated for her skeletal frame. In 1380, priests called her fragile body holy beauty. Girls all over Europe took notice. For them, refusing food wasn't just about faith, it was a way to avoid forced marriages, escape sexual assault, or gain a voice in a world that ignored them. Catherine survived on communion bread and even pus from the sick, describing it as sharing in Christ's suffering. Convents soon turned into contests of who could endure hunger the longest. Sister Columba of Reedy lived for 7 years on nothing but communion wafers. Each week, her fellow nuns weighed her, cheering every pound she lost as proof of God's favor. Angela of Foligno drank the water used to clean lepers' wounds, calling the floating scabs as sweet as the Eucharist. The church didn't hide these stories, they published them as examples to inspire young women. Soon, bishops even drew up guidelines for what they called holy fasting. The body had to show signs: no menstruation to prove chastity, sharp bones poking through skin to prove rejection of earthly desires, fainting during prayer to prove closeness to God. Doctors were not allowed to help. Feeding a starving girl was labeled blasphemy. Parents who tried to save their daughters risked being thrown out of the church entirely. The physical results were horrific. Hair fell out in handfuls. Teeth loosened until they dropped. Skin turned a sickly green as organs shut down. Hearts skipped beats and then simply stopped. But instead of being treated as warnings, these signs were celebrated as proof of holiness. Young women lined up to enter convents, convinced starvation was their only chance at freedom or respect. Catherine wasn't the only one who gave herself to this deadly devotion. Margaret of Cortona carved the name of Jesus into her chest with a knife, and then starved herself until her wounds rotted. She called the stench a perfume for Christ. Clare of Assisi ate so little she stopped menstruating at 15. Priests claimed this proved her purity. The stories spread like wildfire. Across medieval Europe, if you wanted to dodge an unwanted marriage, you stopped eating. If you wanted people to listen to your visions, you starved until hallucinations felt like prophecies. The statistics are chilling. Between 1200 and 1500, more than half of all female saints were women who wasted away through fasting. Thousands of nameless girls died imitating them. Convent records carefully noted these deaths as if they were victories. Sister Beatrice of Nazareth died at 31, described only as light as holy bread. Sister Ida of Louvain wasted away at 28, living her last year chewing on tree bark. Sister Juliana of Cornon lasted until 35, eating nothing but the Eucharist for 5 years. The Church's reaction wasn't to stop it, it was to institutionalize it. In 1495, bishops published a book called The Miraculous Abstinence of the Holy Virgins, which outlined starvation as a legitimate path to sainthood. Instead of condemning the slow deaths of young women, they turned them into official blueprints for holiness. The rules were strict and step by step. First, stop eating meat. Then, cut out everything except plain bread. In the final stage, you were told to live only on the holy bread from church. The guide even gave tips on how to secretly hide food so others couldn't force you to eat, and special prayers to help you ignore the gnawing pain in your stomach. Copies of this book spread through convents all over Europe, turning into a kind of handbook for slow, holy self-destruction. The most terrifying part wasn't just the starving itself, it was the twisted religious logic that made it seem noble. Women were told their bodies were full of sin. Since Eve's hunger for forbidden fruit had doomed humanity, women's hunger in general was seen as especially dangerous. So by defeating their own desire to eat, women believed they could make up for Eve's original mistake. And this wasn't some strange fringe idea, it was preached everywhere. Priests, teachers, and parents drilled it into young girls that wanting food showed the darkness inside them. While nuns wasted away in the name of God, other women were burned alive for sins that only existed in someone's imagination. Take Sarah Good, for example. In 1692, her neighbor stood up in court and claimed, "I dreamed she turned into a yellow bird and flew through my window." The judge simply nodded. In Salem, dreams were treated like hard evidence. If you showed up in someone's nightmare, that was enough to get you killed. Sarah Good was poor, homeless, and caring for a 4-year-old daughter, making her the easiest kind of victim. That's how it always worked. Poor women were blamed first, but soon the net widened. Anyone with property became a target, because the moment someone was accused, their land and belongings could be taken. Sarah Good had nothing, but Sarah Osborne owned land. Rebecca Nurse had a large estate. Conveniently, many of the wealthier women were suddenly accused of being witches. And guess who often benefited? Families like the Putnams. Young Ann Putnam Jr., just 12 years old, accused 62 people all by herself. During the trials, her father somehow ended up with 3 new plots of land. The reasoning was twisted beyond belief. The court declared that the devil couldn't copy the face of an innocent person. So if someone claimed they saw your spirit doing evil in their dreams, it meant you had willingly let Satan use your body. The only way to prove your innocence was to admit guilt. If you confessed, you lived. If you insisted you were innocent, you died. Sarah Good refused to lie about herself, and for that, she hanged. But the madness didn't stop with dreams. The physical tests were humiliating and cruel. Women were stripped naked and searched for so-called devil's marks. Any mole, freckle, or birthmark was suspicious. Judges jabbed these spots with needles. If the woman didn't react, they claimed the devil had numbed her skin. If she cried out too loudly, they said the devil was fighting back. Martha Carrier had nothing more than a small mole on her shoulder, but the examiner declared it was a nipple for demons to suckle on. That mark alone sealed her fate. She hanged, all because of a birthmark. These trials also revealed something darker about power. Suddenly, teenage girls discovered that their screams and fits could control the entire town. Abigail Williams perfected the act. She would fall to the floor, thrash around, and claim she saw the accused woman's ghost choking her. The other girls quickly followed her lead. Together, they put on performances so convincing that adults believed every word. Salem turned into a deadly stage play, and the girls were the stars. One detail often brushed aside is the gender breakdown. Out of around 200 accused, nearly 80% were women. Of the 20 people executed, 14 were female. And the numbers tell another story too. Most of these women were in their late 40s, past childbearing years, often widowed or living independently. In short, they were women who didn't fit neatly into society's boxes. They owned land, spoke their minds, or simply lived without a man controlling them. That made them dangerous in the eyes of the community. And then there was Giles Corey, whose bravery still echoes centuries later. He was the only man crushed to death. Refusing to enter a plea, he made sure the court couldn't seize his family's land. For 3 brutal days they piled heavy stones on his chest, demanding he speak. His final words were, "Add more weight." He died, but his silence protected his children's inheritance. His wife Martha was executed anyway, but she went to the gallows knowing Giles had fought the system with the only power left to him, his refusal to play by its rules. When the chaos ended, the greed behind it all became clear. Sheriff George Corwin eagerly seized homes, land, and belongings from the accused. The trials weren't only about fear of witches, they were also about wealth, power, and the way society punished women who didn't fit the mold. He took it all: land, animals, furniture, even the tiny toys children once held in their hands. By the time the witch trials came to an end, he had piled up a fortune. Families like the Putnams grew richer and richer, while the families of the accused were left with nothing but grief. What happened in Salem was just the beginning. Europe would later take this system of fear and turn it into a machine of mass killing. In 1486, a book was published called the Malleus Maleficarum, which means Hammer of Witches. It laid out 117 different ways to torture people, complete with drawings to show exactly how to do it. Next to the Bible, it became one of the most popular books in Europe. The men who wrote it, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, didn't just give instructions, they built a handbook for the mass murder of women. Their central claim was simple: women were weaker, more lustful, and more jealous than men, which made them easy prey for the devil. They wrote that women's tongues spread lies, their desires invited demons, and even their beauty could be proof of witchcraft. According to the book, it didn't matter if you were poor or wealthy, quiet or outspoken, plain-looking or attractive, any woman could be labeled a witch. It was a trap with no escape. Page after page showed cruelty dressed up as justice. One infamous method was the strappado. In this torture, a woman's hands were tied behind her back, heavy weights fastened to her feet, and then she was yanked into the air by her wrists until her shoulders snapped out of place. But the book didn't stop there. It suggested pouring water down her throat until she choked, holding burning feathers under her nose, or pressing red-hot irons against her skin. The point wasn't to kill quickly. The point was to break her until she confessed, no matter how much pain it took. The scale of this slaughter is almost impossible to imagine. Historians believe that between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed during Europe's witch hunts, and around 80% of them were women. Germany was especially ruthless. In the town of Quedlinburg, 133 women were burned alive in a single day in 1589. In Würzburg, 400 women were executed in less than 5 years, including little girls who were only 7 years old. One small village was left with just 2 women alive when the hunts finally ended. But here's the part most people miss: the witch hunts weren't just about fear of the devil. They were about money. Every accusation filled someone's pockets. Witch hunters were paid for every guilty verdict. Torturers got bonuses if they forced a confession quickly. Local officials claimed the land, houses, and savings of the accused. The Malleus even explained how to freeze someone's assets as soon as they were accused, so they couldn't hire help or fight back. Once labeled a witch, your family couldn't step in either, because defending you meant they might be accused too. The system paid for itself, feeding on women's lives. Wealthy widows became the most profitable prey. They owned land, had no husband to protect them, and their deaths made others rich. Some women, however, refused to give the hunters what they wanted. They stayed silent under torture, never confessing, because they knew the moment they admitted guilt, they'd be forced to accuse others. By dying without speaking, they cut off the chain of accusations and saved others from their fate. The book complained about these women and advised torturers to threaten their children or torture relatives in front of them to break their will. For almost 3 centuries, the Malleus Maleficarum guided witch hunters. The final official witch execution in Europe took place in 1782, when a Swiss woman named Anna Glee was put to death. By then, the methods described in the book had been polished and reused under a different name: medicine. The same restraints, examinations, and cruel tools appeared in doctors' hands. Centuries later, one doctor even prepared to cut into a woman's clitoris, telling her with a straight face, "This will cure your obsession with reading." In 1858, London doctors claimed they had finally figured out why women were hysterical. They insisted the problem came from the female body itself, especially sexual organs, which they believed distracted women from being obedient. A surgeon named Isaac Baker Brown became famous for pushing a brutal cure. He promoted clitoridectomy, the cutting away of the clitoris, as the answer to nearly every kind of so-called misbehavior in women. The list of supposed illnesses was absurdly long: wanting to read books, touching themselves, refusing marriage duties, being attracted to other women, even asking for divorce. If a woman was outspoken, restless, or simply didn't act the way her husband wanted, doctors said surgery was the solution. Brown performed this operation on girls as young as 10 and women as old as 70. It lasted only about 8 minutes, and there was no anesthesia. Patients were tied down by nurses while Brown used scissors to cut away what he saw as the source of the problem. He then proudly wrote up case studies bragging about the results. One young woman, aged 23, was accused of reading too many novels. After surgery, Brown boasted that her cure was complete because she stopped asking for library books. Another patient, aged 31, had refused her husband in bed. After surgery, she became, in his words, obedient to her marital duties. What makes this even more shocking is that people didn't see Brown as a fringe doctor. He was celebrated as a leader, even serving as president of the London Medical Society. His book on curing epilepsy, hysteria, and female insanity was reprinted multiple times, and his methods were taught in medical schools. Doctors across Europe and America copied him. And clitoridectomy wasn't the only assault passed off as medicine. Another doctor, William Goodell, believed the ovaries were the cause of women's emotions. His cure was to remove them entirely. He called it normal ovarotomy and performed hundreds of these surgeries. He kept neat charts showing how women became calmer afterwards if they survived. Nearly a quarter of his patients died, but he brushed it off as an acceptable cost for ridding women of disorders. The asylum system made this cruelty worse. With just one man's signature, a woman could be locked away for life. Husbands often used it to get rid of wives who challenged them. One such woman was Elizabeth Packard. While she slept, her husband signed the papers, and she woke up locked inside the Jacksonville Insane Asylum. Her symptoms were listed as religious overexcitement and novel reading. In truth, her only crime was disagreeing with her minister husband about theology. Elizabeth spent 3 years fighting for freedom while secretly documenting the horrors she saw. She described endless cold baths where women were held underwater until they fainted, feeding tubes forced through noses that left throats torn, and heavy restraint chairs that cut off circulation. Some women were strapped to boards and spun until they vomited blood, while others were locked into tranquilizing chairs where they couldn't move for days. Doctors carefully tracked which methods broke women's spirits fastest. Money kept the system alive. Asylums were paid by families or local churches for every patient they kept, That meant long-term patients brought steady income, while cured patients were bad for business. Dr. Thomas Kirkbride even designed special asylum buildings with high walls, barred windows, and remote locations to keep women from escaping. By 1880, more than 100,000 women in America were locked inside asylums. Many weren't sick at all. Their crimes included things like showing political passion, disagreeing with men, or simply having irregular periods. As horrifying as this was, history held even darker punishments for women who demanded freedom. During the French Revolution, a woman named Olympe de Gouges dared to publish the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, boldly saying women deserved the same rights as men. On November 3, 1793, she was led to the guillotine. As the blade was sharpened, she faced death for nothing more than taking the revolution's own promises of liberty, equality, and fraternity seriously. She had the courage to say something no one wanted to hear. If women could be dragged to the guillotine the same as men, then they should have the same right to take part in government. On the morning of her death, crowds filled the square long before the blade was raised. In Paris, executions had become the city's favorite show, but when the prisoner was a woman who spoke about politics, the audience grew larger and louder. The Revolutionary Court declared her guilty of forgetting the virtues of her sex. The prosecutor, Fouquier Tinville, didn't just mention her writings. He singled out her effort to create political clubs for women, calling them more dangerous to society than any royalist conspiracy. That judgment cut especially deep because women had been part of the revolution from the very start. They had marched on Versailles demanding bread for their starving children. They had stormed the Bastille side by side with men. They had handed over their jewelry to fund the new armies, knitted stockings for the soldiers, and rolled bandages for the wounded. But when they asked for even the simplest rights to vote, to leave violent marriages, to own their property, the same revolution they had fueled turned its back on them. In her prison cell, she hid one last pamphlet, a small piece of paper that carried words far stronger than swords. It declared, "A woman is born free, and her rights are equal to those of a man. Any differences must be based only on what benefits society as a whole." Those plain words became the reason she lost her head. Only days before her arrest, the government had outlawed women's clubs completely. The Jacobin claimed that women meddling in politics violated the natural order of things. Even Robespierre, the leader who spoke endlessly of liberty, insisted that women's only duty was to stay at home and raise future citizens, not to be citizens themselves. She wasn't the only one punished for stepping out of line. Manon Roland was executed for hosting salons where politics were debated. Her last words before the blade fell were, "O liberty, how many crimes are done in your name?" Charlotte Corday went to her death for stabbing Marais, but what truly condemned her was daring to act politically as a woman. After her execution, an artist who painted her severed head recorded how the executioner slapped her face, a humiliation used only against women who defied their roles. The betrayal went even further. The revolutionary leaders not only executed outspoken women, but they rewrote laws to control every woman in France. Divorce, which had briefly been made easier so women could leave cruel husbands, was quickly changed to keep them trapped in abusive marriages. Property rights that once gave them control over dowries were taken back. The government even forced women to wear cockades to prove loyalty, then mocked and punished them for the manly act of wearing political symbols. The mobs that gathered at executions showed an ugly side of human nature. Crowds hurled insults and sang obscene songs about women's bodies. They screamed threats of sexual violence at women as they climbed the steps to the scaffold. Marie Antoinette herself, though already disgraced, faced pamphlets filled not with her political crimes, but with pornographic fantasies. Newspapers printed lurid details of women's appearances, focusing on breasts and hips instead of their ideas. This cruelty served a purpose. It warned every woman watching that if you dared to enter politics, you would not only die, you would be stripped of dignity in the process. The punishment did not stop at death. Within months of Olympi's execution, the government passed sweeping bans. Women could not attend political gatherings, could not organize in groups larger than 5, and could not even deliver petitions. The revolution that had promised freedom and equality for all made it clear. Those promises did not include women. French women would wait another century and a half before finally gaining the right to vote. But this was only the beginning. Generations later, in Franco's Spain, punishment of women took an even darker turn. This time, it wasn't just women's voices that were silenced. It was their children who were stolen. In 1943, in a Madrid maternity ward, Maria Gutierrez had just given birth. She was exhausted, but overjoyed. Hours later, a nun came to her bedside, face calm and cruel, and whispered, "Your baby didn't survive." Yet from the next room, Maria could hear the thin cry of a newborn. She would later learn the truth. Under Franco's rule, the regime declared that Republican women were unfit mothers. Their infants were taken from them and handed to loyalist families to raise as proper citizens. For Maria, and thousands like her, motherhood itself became a weapon used against them. They had already signed the papers to give the baby to a loyal nationalist family, and the system ran like clockwork. Dr. Antonio Vallejo Nahara, the top psychiatrist under Franco, claimed that Marxism was a disease passed down through mothers. According to his research on women imprisoned for political reasons, Republican mothers carried a kind of criminal gene. The solution was simple in their eyes: take the babies away the moment they were born, place them with families who believed in Franco's ideals, and protect Spain's racial purity. The scale was horrifying. Historians estimate that between 1936 and 1990, around 300,000 children were taken. But the cold numbers hide the personal tragedies. Nurses would show mothers frozen corpses, insisting these were their babies. Mothers weren't allowed to see graves, and drugs during labor blurred their memories. By the time the women gave birth, adoption papers were already signed. The Patronato de Protección a la Mujer added another layer of control. This board monitored young women for immoral behavior. Wearing pants, smoking, reading foreign books, or speaking political ideas could mark them as dangerous. Girls could be taken from families seen as not Catholic enough. Many were forced into labor in convents, while nuns arranged the adoptions of any children they had. Daily humiliations were calculated to break them. Women in nationalist prisons were subjected to mandatory virginity checks, even older women or those who had multiple children. These exams were not medical. They were about power. Guards made political prisoners sing fascist songs while naked. Heads were shaved in patterns marking them as rebels. Castor oil was given to make them vomit or have diarrhea. Then they were denied access to bathrooms. The Patronato even created a point system for women's so-called redemption. Attending Mass earned points, informing on fellow prisoners earned double, and sexual submission to guards earned the most, though this was never officially written down. Women who got enough points might see their children under supervision. Those who refused lost all contact. Some women tried to play the system for years, not knowing their babies had been adopted within days. Carmen Marquez learned the truth 40 years later. Her daughter, who she had been told died in 1950, had actually lived 3 blocks away all her life. The adoptive parents had paid 100,000 pesetas to the clinic. Carmen had unknowingly passed her daughter on the street hundreds of times. The girl had been told her mother was a prostitute who abandoned her. When they finally met, Carmen took her to the grave she had visited every week for 40 years only, to find it held the bones of a stillborn boy from another family. This network of stolen children involved almost everyone. Doctors faked death certificates. Priests changed baptismal records. Nuns ran the adoptions. and government officials processed the false documents. The system continued until 1990, evolving from political punishment to pure profit. Poor women were told their babies had died. Wealthy families received healthy infants. The Catholic Church helped coordinate transfers and destroy evidence. But elsewhere in Europe, the Nazis took this cruelty to terrifying new heights. At Ravensbrück, doctors used women as test subjects for surgical experiments. Dr. Karl Gars, for the German army, pressed glass shards into wounds to study infections. 19-year-old Władysława Karolka, a Polish resistance fighter, was one of the prisoners. The women were called rabbits, used as living test animals. The experiments followed strict procedures. Make wounds like battlefield injuries. Insert glass, wood, dirt, or bacteria, stitch them up, and carefully record how infections developed over time. The horrors were methodical, scientific, and utterly inhuman. At Ravensbrück, surviving one horrific surgery didn't mean safety. It only meant the experiments continued. Doctors broke bones to study healing, severed nerves to watch paralysis spread, and removed muscles to see how the body adapted. The women quietly compared their scars and stolen moments, realizing they had become walking medical textbooks, each body a chapter of suffering. Ravensbrück was designed to destroy women. Entire medical blocks were built for forced sterilization experiments. Dr. Karl Klauberg injected corrosive chemicals into wombs to determine which mixtures caused permanent infertility. Women writhed in unimaginable pain, their reproductive organs burning, as he carefully noted which formulas created lasting sterility versus temporary injury. Their screams filled the halls, yet the doctors treated it all as precise science. Despite this, the women refused to give up. They secretly began smuggling gunpowder from the nearby munitions factory, taking the tiniest amounts that would go unnoticed. Some hid grains under fingernails, in hair, or tucked in corners of the mouth. Vlet Szabo, a French prisoner tortured nearly to the point of collapse, coordinated the operation, moving explosives through the camp with careful timing. Over months, the women collected enough to supply a resistance operation in the men's camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Even those whose bodies were partially destroyed by experiments participated. Zofia Kołodziejska, missing both legs, acted as lookout. Maria Grałowska, paralyzed from nerve experiments, gave warnings through subtle hand movements. They knew discovery meant death, but in a place where every day was already a battle with mortality, their courage became unstoppable. In October 1944, the plan came together. The smuggled gunpowder destroyed Crematorium 4, killing SS guards and wrecking the machinery used to murder thousands. It was a signal that resistance still lived, even in the most terrifying conditions. Nazi retaliation was swift and brutal. Rosa Robot, Elertner, Esther Y. Blum, and Regina Safirstein were publicly hanged for their involvement, yet witnesses reported they sang songs of defiance as they were executed. The medical experiments continued, but the women sabotaged charts, contaminated cultures, and damaged equipment whenever possible, undermining the system from within. When Soviet forces liberated Ravensbrück, they discovered 7,000 survivors, many permanently disabled. These women testified at Nuremberg, exposing the cruelty and showing scars that told stories no words could capture. While Dr. Gart was executed, most perpetrators evaded justice. The survivors formed lifelong networks, helping each other navigate life with mutilated bodies, insisting on the title Ravensbrück warriors, not victims. Liberation did not guarantee freedom for all. In August 1945, Harbin, Manchuria, saw Japanese families facing impossible choices under Soviet occupation. 14-year-old Yuki Tanaka stood in her best kimono, trembling as her father handed her over to a Soviet officer to spare her younger siblings. The term comfort women hides the truth. These girls were not volunteers. They were sacrifices. Families selected them using cruel calculations, age, looks, perceived strength, all to decide who would endure assault to save the rest. Girls were sent to buildings presented as comfort stations, though everyone knew these were centers of sexual abuse. The daily reality was terrifying. The system was bureaucratic, yet brutally efficient. Nurses handed mothers frozen dead babies to manipulate grief, drugging them during labor to ensure compliance, while adoption papers were often signed before birth. Families were misled, children stolen, and records falsified. Priests, doctors, nuns, and government officials all played roles in a network that spanned decades. These horrors continued for decades, leaving deep scars not only on the bodies of women, but on the memory of entire communities. Numbers only tell part of the story. The human cost, the anguish, betrayal, and stolen lives is immeasurable. Historians estimate that around 10,000 Japanese women and girls were raped during the Soviet occupation of Manchuria, most between 13 and 25 years old, though soldiers rarely cared about age. What numbers don't show is how families were involved. Unlike the chaos of random wartime assaults, this was organized. Communities held meetings, made rotation schedules, and enforced compliance. Yuki's younger sister Ko, only 11 at the time, hid behind a door and later remembered the sound of their father's footsteps returning alone. Yuki was gone, her belongings vanished, her name erased from conversation. Ko understood what had happened. Every family on the street made similar sacrifices. The Yamada family sent their eldest daughter. The Watanabes sent two, and the childless widow Sasaki became considered communal property. The cruelest part: it wasn't forced by soldiers' fathers, and community leaders volunteered daughters, believing controlled sacrifice would prevent random violence. They were wrong. Soldiers still assaulted other girls, yet families clung to the myth that sacrifice protected the rest. By sunrise, 17 girls had disappeared into buildings that became processing centers for human suffering. Local leaders managed schedules, monitored hygiene, not for the girls' safety, but to protect soldiers from disease, and arranged doctors to perform abortions on pregnant children. The illusion of control kept the system running. Some girls resisted in secret. They shared ways to end their lives quickly, showing which poisons worked fastest, how to tie nooses with kimono belts, and where to cut to die swiftly. They warned newcomers about the most violent soldiers and formed distraction networks to help others escape during shift changes. But escape meant shame. Families would reject them, and survival often seemed worse than a proper death. When the occupation ended in 1946, the consequences lasted generations. Survivors returned to complete social exile. Families refused to speak to them. Marriage was impossible, and many committed suicide later, haunted by memories and rejection. Most who survived stayed silent forever, carrying horrors they could never share. This tragedy is only part of a much larger story of female survival across centuries. In Chiter, for example, 8,000 women chose fire rather than being violated. Think about the sheer resilience of your ancestors. Your great-great-grandmother survived childhood illnesses that killed half her sisters, gave birth when maternal mortality reached 40%, escaped violence that claimed 1 in 3 women, endured famines targeting female children, avoided accusations of witchcraft, and survived imprisonment or systematic killings. The odds are staggering. Take 10 generations, roughly 300 years, where each woman had to live to reproductive age, give birth, and raise at least one daughter. Even if every generation faced only a 50% survival rate for girls, your existence probability would be 0.5 to the 10th power, about 0.1%. Historical reality was harsher. The Black Death alone could have wiped out your line multiple times. European witch hunts, localized massacres, and villages where 90% of women died created deadly bottlenecks. If your ancestor lived in one of those places, she was part of the rare 10% who survived against impossible odds. Every woman who lived through those centuries carried courage, luck, and sheer resilience that directly shaped your existence today. Maybe it was luck, or perhaps she was clever, well-connected, or simply too cautious for danger to find her. Against every grim statistic, she survived when she statistically shouldn't have. But here's the staggering truth. Every woman in your maternal line survived horrors that would have destroyed most. When Victorian factories filled the air with poisonous lead, your ancestor either avoided working there or endured the exposure and lived. When convents in the Middle Ages preached fasting until death, she either stayed away or found enough nourishment to thrive. When witch hunters scoured villages, she escaped suspicion. When armies invaded, she either fled or endured the occupation. When cruel doctors experimented, she was never selected. When entire communities demanded children for sacrifice, she wasn't chosen. The strategies these women used were astonishing. They shared secret knowledge, warning each other of danger, hiding food, creating escape routes, and leaving coded signals in lullabies and fairy tales. They learned which actions drew violence and which kept them invisible. These women were masters of survival, experts navigating a world built to harm them. But this survival came with enormous costs. They learned to act submissive while hiding inner strength, balancing public obedience with private defiance. They made impossible choices, marrying dangerous men to stay safe from worse, abandoning some children to save others, informing on friends to protect family. They endured moral compromises that would horrify modern women. And then there is Chiter, where the fire had been roaring for 6 long hours. The last group approached the pyre grandmothers carrying newborns, whose mothers had already entered the flames. The fire had already consumed thousands, yet it still blazed with terrifying efficiency. These women had planned everything carefully, enough wood to ensure total cremation, leaving nothing for enemy soldiers to violate. Padmini, a 67-year-old grandmother, led this final procession. She had coordinated every detail from stockpiling firewood to organizing the line of women. She carried her newest grandchild, born just days earlier, soothed with opium so the infant would sleep through the fire. Around them, the fortress shook as the enemy hammered its walls. The air was filled with a dreadful symphony, the crackle of flames consuming silk and flesh, the distant boom of war drums marking the siege, prayers rising from thousands of women, growing fewer with each moment, and the soft lullabies grandmothers whispered to infants about to die. The orange glow cast long, haunting shadows across the fortress walls, shadows that would be remembered forever. These grandmothers had survived countless sieges. They knew what conquering armies did to captured women. Padmini herself had witnessed the aftermath of Ranthambore, seeing women returned as broken bodies, minds shattered, begging for the deaths they had been denied. She had made her choice decades earlier. If Chiter fell, not a single woman would suffer that fate. Every grandmother agreed. They would guide every female soul into the flames, sparing them from the horrors of enemy hands. As they reached the pyre, some tried to hand infants to women already processed, hoping someone might save them. But the grandmothers gently, firmly returned each child. This was their mercy, a quick, peaceful death in loving arms rather than a slow, brutal torment. Every woman, every girl from the queen to the lowest servant would be part of this final act. When the enemy broke through the gates, they found only ashes. Where they had expected women to enslave and abuse, there was silence. No cries, no pleas, only the calm remnants of a meticulously executed, heartbreaking resistance. Some soldiers gagged and turned away, unable to stomach the sight of so many choosing death over submission. Others shouted in disbelief, realizing the women they expected to enslave had claimed their own fate instead. 8,000 lives, 8,000 dreams, 8,000 stories vanished in the fire that morning. Every skill, hope, and possibility turned to ash in moments. But here you are, reading these words, because somewhere along your family line, a woman made a different choice. Maybe she stood at the edge of a similar blaze and stepped back. Maybe she hid while others perished. Perhaps she lived where mass suicide never seemed necessary. Or she survived capture and managed to rebuild a life from the fragments around her. Your existence is proof that thousands of women in your ancestry navigated history's relentless attempts to erase them, carving out tiny paths toward survival. Think about that for a moment. Every woman in your bloodline faced moments when the world seemed determined to crush her spirit. When living as a female felt almost unbearable. When laws, medicine, religious rules, and communities worked together to control, punish, or destroy them. And yet, by luck, cunning, or sheer strength, they endured long enough to bring forth the next generation. You are the result of countless improbable survivals, the living proof of women who should have perished but refused to be erased. The women at Chiter made a choice that history cannot ignore. Fire seemed a kinder fate than the torture awaiting them. They took control of the end of their lives rather than leaving it in the hands of their conquerors. And yet, that act also shows the depth of history's cruelty. The horror isn't just the flames, it's the world that forced 8,000 women to see death as the only path left. Their collective decision was a failure of society, a signal of how profoundly human cruelty can shape destiny. We live now in a world where such choices feel distant, almost mythic, yet the systems that led to the fires of Chiter didn't vanish. They morphed into subtler forms of oppression, economic dependence, medical control, legal limitations. The flames became metaphorical, but women still bear the heat of societal constraints. Studying history's darkest moments isn't meant to trap us in despair. It's to remind us of the countless women who endured horrors we can barely imagine and still survived to pass on life. You exist because they did. Every heartbeat in your body is a testament to their courage, their endurance, and their triumph over impossible odds. Against math, against history, they lived. That survival might be humanity's most astonishing miracle.